Today I'm going to talk to you about digital line art, how to reproduce the appearance of black and white pen and ink artwork using Adobe Illustrator. Black and white pen and ink line art has been a really popular medium among medical and scientific illustrators throughout the 20th century. It's particularly popular for any kind of artwork that's going to appear in print, such as scientific journal illustrations, textbook illustrations, or patient education materials. The reason it's so popular for printed media is that black and white line art is so easy to reproduce in print. You're talking about a very high contrast medium where you're simply printing solid black lines on white paper. It's much easier to reproduce in print than a halftone image, such as a grayscale or color image. Those kinds of images, you have to generate that delicate halftone pattern, which is just a little bit trickier to print accurately. So these high contrast images with just solid black lines on white paper are cheaper and faster to reproduce in print. These kinds of images also reproduce really well just on inexpensive equipment that offices may have, schools and medical offices may have in their office already, such as a photocopier. So schools can reproduce large numbers of handouts for students, or a medical office could reproduce large numbers of patient education materials to distribute to their patients by simply copying them on a photocopier. These high contrast black and white images reproduce really well in photocopies, whereas it would be much more difficult to photocopy something with grayscale or color images. If you look at black and white line art from the early part of the 20th century, you see that most of it is very, very highly detailed and very highly rendered, with lots of shading using cross-hatching or stippling, or another technique that I'll show you in just a second called eyelashing. And I think one of the reasons that these early illustrations, these early pen and ink illustrations, are so incredibly detailed and have all of this intricate shading is I think they were trying to capture the appearance of the woodcut engravings and the copperplate etchings that were so common in anatomy books and medical books throughout the Renaissance and right up, through the 19th century. This is a beautiful illustration by Max Bradel. You can see just how incredibly meticulous and detailed it is, but keep in mind that something like this would be enormously time-consuming to create. Here's a simple example of what's called the eyelashing technique, and I think you can probably see where it gets that name. All of the shading is accomplished using these curved lines that have pretty much uniform spacing, but the lines become slightly thicker in the middle and then taper to a point on both ends, like an eyelash. These were done using either a quill pen, or some people even used a very, very delicate red sable brush to achieve this. I was never able to master this. I did try doing it with both a quill pen and with a sable brush, but never had the control, the eye-hand coordination, I guess, to really make this look nice. This is actually a part of an exercise put together by Jerry Hodge. He was an instructor in the medical illustration program at the University of Michigan back when they used to have a program. That program closed in, I believe, 2004. But he was just an amazing ink artist. So over the course of the 20th century, pen and ink styles have become much more simplified. If you look at most pen and ink work produced today, you find that there is little or no cross-hatching, no stippling, little or no eyelashing in the work. And yet, despite the lack of detailed shading, contemporary pen and ink work still has a sense of three-dimensional form. I mean, when I look at this brain, I feel as though the cerebrum actually has a sense of form. The cerebellum has a sense of three-dimensional form. I'm even getting a sense for the direction of the light source. The standard light source that we use in scientific illustration coming from the upper left. Now that sense of form and lighting is coming entirely from varying the thickness, or what we call the weight, of the pen and ink lines around the image. This is by Tim Phelps, who is a professor in the Hopkins program, and he's one of the few people I know who is still doing a lot of traditional pen and ink work. He uses Micron technical pens. Here's another example of Tim's work. Again, notice that there is no cross-hatching, no stippling, no eyelashing. The nuclei almost look like they have a sort of a cross-hatching technique to them, but really that's just to make them look sort of ghosted by drawing the nuclei with little lines instead of drawing it as a solid black shape. It just makes them look a little bit lighter, so they look ghosted inside the cell. Now, one thing I'd like you to do is take a moment and look really closely at the individual cells in the retina. And if you look at each and every cell, just about every cell that I'm looking at, there's a little variation in the thickness of the pen and ink lines, where there's a little bit darker area, a little bit thicker lines on either the right side or sort of the bottom right side of each of those cells, and then slightly thinner lines towards the upper left side of each cell. Again, to imply just a subtle sense of upper left-hand lighting and give the cells just the most subtle sense of three-dimensional form. Here's another beautiful example of contemporary pen and ink work. This is actually by one of our alumni, Ann Olson, who works at the Carolinas Medical Center in North Carolina. She's a graduate of our master's program from the 1990s. And again, you see there's no cross-hatching, no stippling, no eyelashing, no attempt at any shading. And yet I still feel as though the hands and the child's face have a recognizable sense of form. And a lot of this is coming from the variation in line weight, the variation in thickness of those ink lines on the hands and on the head. One of my personal favorites, this guy's work I just absolutely love. This is David Cheney, who is one of the staff illustrators at the Mayo Clinic. And I think these are just absolutely gorgeous. I think this line work is just so beautiful that it's just as wonderful as, you know, a fully rendered halftone or grayscale or full color image. In fact, in some ways, I'm more impressed with this than I would be with a beautiful, you know, fully rendered grayscale or color image, because it's actually more challenging, I think, to achieve this level of realism in a simple medium such as pen and ink, black and white line work. I feel as though the hands and then the different parts of the baby and the mother have a sense of depth and form. Look at the image on the left. Notice the mother's hand and forearm in the foreground. And you may notice, if you look very, very carefully at the thickness of the lines, that the line that completely surrounds her forearm and hand is just a little bit thicker, very subtly thicker than some of the lines of the baby. And that's using a little variation in line weight to create a sense of perspective, so that you really feel as though that hand is in front of the baby's face. In the right-hand image, look closely at the baby's arm and forearm and compare the line on the upper left side of the arm and forearm to the line on the lower right edge of that arm and forearm. And I think you'll see that there's a subtle difference in the thickness of the line on the left and on the lower right. That's to suggest lighting, to suggest that we have an upper left-hand light source. And it gives that baby's arm a little sense of three-dimensional form, even though that difference in line weight is just so incredibly subtle. There's also a slight difference in line weight between the baby's arm and forearm as compared to the mother's hand, which is wrapped around the baby's chest. I feel as though the lines on the baby's arm, both on the lit side and the shaded side of the baby's arm, those lines are just slightly thicker or heavier than the lines of the fingers in the mother's hand. And again, that helps give a sense of depth to the baby's arm. It makes it very obvious that the baby's arm is crossing over in front of the mother's hand. Something else I want to point out on this image, take a look at the right-hand image and look at the baby's sleeve, the sleeve of the baby's t-shirt. And look how that sleeve overlaps the upper part of the arm. And notice that there are tiny little filled-in black triangular areas which suggest the presence of a little cast shadow, where that sleeve is casting just a little hint of a shadow onto the baby's arm. You can also see that in the mother's sleeve in the right-hand image. Notice again that there are some little filled-in triangular areas where the sleeve of her t-shirt is overlapping her arm. You can see it in the left image. Again, the baby's t-shirt, where it overlaps the baby's arm. In the left image, you see there's a little filled-in triangle. And even in the far upper left area of the left-hand image, where the mother's thumb is overlapping her other hand, you see there's a little black filled-in triangle there. And actually, if you look closely all over the image, every place where you see, for example, a wrinkle in the edge of the clothing, where that wrinkle meets the edge of the clothing, there's a tiny, tiny little black filled-in area. Where there are wrinkles in the baby's hands and fingers, oftentimes there are these little tiny filled-in triangles where those wrinkles meet the edge of the baby's hand or arm. These things actually have a name. They're called snodgrasses. They are named after an American entomologist, an American scientist, who illustrated all of his own research papers. And he was a very accomplished pen and ink artist. And I'm not sure if anybody's been able to research this and find out if he was really the first person to do this, but he was known for using these little filled-in solid black areas to imply little cast shadows where different objects were touching one another or overlapping one another. And so scientific illustrators to this day refer to these little black areas as snodgrasses. And I'll show you that in more detail shortly. Next, I'd like to show you how to use variation in line weight to create the illusion of three-dimensional form and the illusion of a directional light source. Later, I'll actually show you how to create variations in line weight using Illustrator, but for now I just want to focus on the principles of how the differences in line weight create that illusion of form and lighting on objects. And first, let me say that the variation in line weight can be very, very subtle. The difference in line weight, for example, from one side of an object to the other, from the lit side to the shaded side of an object, can maybe be the difference of just a quarter of a point. So you might have a 1.5 point stroke on one side, the shaded side, and a 1.25 point stroke on the lit side. But that difference of just a quarter point is barely perceptible to the human eye. It's just enough to trick the eye into seeing a sense of form or lighting. So I've broken this down into three major principles, three major things to keep in mind when you're trying to use variation in line weight to create a sense of form and lighting. First of all, you want to put a heavier outline around all of the major objects in the illustration. And you want to distinguish the major structures from anything that would be considered just sort of an internal detail or texture. So for example, if you were drawing a person, you'd put a heavier outline around their entire body, probably a heavier outline around each of their limbs, but any kind of internal details such as the edge of their hair, the facial features, lines between different parts of their clothing, such as the boundary between their shirt and their pants or something like that, those kinds of internal details would be secondary. So those would be rendered with a much thinner line. So in this example, you see that there's a bold outline that goes all the way around that tube. There's a fairly bold line around the branch off of that tube that you see in the center of the image. And then there are a couple of other smaller tubular structures which also have relatively heavy outlines around them. But then you also see there are those tiny delicate lines wrapping around the major tube, and those are rendered with much, much thinner lines, the thinnest lines present in this image. And so that makes it very easy to distinguish the overall form of the large curving tube from the details or texture on the surface of the tube. Now, this is something I threw together for the purposes of this video. This is not meant to represent any real structures. It could be a loop of the intestine, and the thin little lines on the surface of the intestine could represent the texture of blood vessels that you see on the surface of the stomach or the intestines, although the intestine would not have a branch coming off of it like you see in the center of the image. Alternatively, this could represent a large vessel, things like the aorta or the brachiocephalic artery, subclavian arteries, and so on. Any of these large arteries actually have a network of vessels on their surface. These are called the vasa vasorum, which literally means the vessels of the vessels. These really big arteries have very thick elastic and muscular walls. The wall of the vessel is so thick that the cells in the wall of the artery can't get enough oxygen and nutrients from the blood that's actually inside the vessel itself. So there actually have to be vessels on the outside of the vessel, tiny vessels on the outside of the major arteries, to supply blood to the cells that make up the arterial wall. So these could be these vasa vasorum. But don't worry so much about what the picture is showing. Let's just focus on how to create this illusion of three-dimensional form and lighting. So like I said, principle number one is just to identify what the major objects are and put somewhat heavier outlines around the major objects, and reserve your thinnest, tiniest lines for any kind of internal details or texture. Second principle is, in any given object, the line on the illuminated side, the lit side that's facing towards the light source, should be a little bit thinner, whereas the line on the opposite side of the object, facing away from the light source, the shaded side, should be a little bit heavier line. And you can see that in the left-hand end of this large tube, that there's a subtle difference in line weight between the upper left side and the bottom right side. It's actually a little bit exaggerated in this image. The difference in line weight can even be a little bit more subtle than what you see here. You also notice towards the right-hand side, just above the label for number 3, that part of this tube is then curving and coming back towards the viewer. And you may notice here again that there's a little bit thicker line on the bottom and a little bit thinner line on the top. Same thing with that smaller branch, that smaller tube that's branching off of the main tube right in the center of the image. There's a subtle difference between the line on the upper left, the lit side, and the bottom right. So that's our second principle in varying line weight, to try to give the illusion of a light source, in this case using that standard upper left-hand lighting that's so common in scientific illustration. The third principle is that objects that are closer to the viewer should have somewhat thicker outlines, and objects that are farther away from the viewer or that are receding back into the distance should be rendered with somewhat thinner lines. And this is using the principle of perspective to try to fool the eye into recognizing which objects are close to you and which are farther away. So you notice at the far left-hand end of the main tube, there are fairly bold lines. They get a little thinner as that tube is receding away from you towards that vertical structure. Then the lines get thicker again as a loop of this tube is coming back towards us near that small branch in the center. And then as you head over towards the upper right, you can tell that the tube is disappearing into the distance, and its outlines get noticeably thinner as it fades into the distance. So pretty simple and straightforward. It's just using the notion of perspective to fool the eye into thinking that some structures are closer to you and some are farther away. So to summarize those three principles, or to kind of put all of those principles together, the heaviest line, the thickest line weight in your entire illustration should be the shaded side of whichever object is closest to the viewer. So it's closer to the viewer, so it's going to have a thicker line because of perspective, and it's the shaded side, so it's going to have a thicker line because it's in shadow. So just to repeat that, the heaviest line in your illustration is going to be the shaded side of whichever object is closer to you, to the viewer. And then you'll use progressively thinner lines to show the lit side, the illuminated side of objects that are close to you, or progressively thinner lines to show objects that are disappearing into the distance. And then finally, the very thinnest lines that you would use in your illustration would be for the internal details or texture. In this case, again, those vasa vasorum, or whatever those little vessels are that are on the surface of the tube. And again, using the example of illustrating a person, things like facial features, the texture of the hair, wrinkles in clothing, and so forth. Those would be your very, very thin lines, using your thinnest possible line weight. Now, in addition to those three major principles about varying line weight, there are some other things that you can use, some other little tricks that you can use to create the illusion of form and lighting, and also just to make the artwork look a little bit natural and more organic. Some of the techniques that I'm going to show you for creating digital line art in Illustrator have a tendency to make artwork that looks very stiff and mechanical. But there are tricks that you can use to make the artwork look a little bit more natural, make the objects look a little bit more organic. So first of all, look towards the upper right where there's a smaller tube passing over the large main tube. This could be something like the ureter crossing the common iliac artery and vein as the ureter heads down into the pelvis towards the urinary bladder. So you have this small tube which is sort of draped over the larger tube. And you'll notice that I've added some snodgrasses, which I mentioned earlier in the video. These are the little black filled-in triangular areas which suggest the presence of a cast shadow, where that small tube is resting directly on the surface of the larger tube. That suggests that the small tube is casting a shadow onto the bigger tube. There's another larger snodgrass visible in this illustration, where that small tube is branching off of the main tube, right in the very center of the illustration. Notice that it also has a darkened triangular area where the small tube is casting a shadow onto the edge of the larger tube as it branches off. So that's another example of a snodgrass. Now, you only want to use the snodgrasses to suggest a cast shadow when two objects are actually in direct contact. So the small tube that's draped over the large tube in the upper right, that small tube is actually resting right on the bigger tube. So there would definitely be a cast shadow there. Or in the center of the illustration where you have that little tube branching off of the big tube. They're actually in contact, where these two tubes meet. And so the small tube casts a shadow onto the large tube. But there are going to be other situations where you want to imply that one object is in front of another, but they're not actually touching. So take a look at that vertical tube that's towards the left half of the image. We're going to assume that that vertical tube is something that is in the background. It's not actually touching the big main tube. It's something that's more distant. And first of all, you can see that I've drawn it with a thinner line weight to imply distance, perspective. But also, if you look very, very closely, and you can see that I've labeled something, that I've broken the line of the object in the background. I've broken its edge just before it passes behind the foreground object. That subtle little trick of breaking the edge of the object in the background also helps to imply a sense of depth and distance. You would not want to put a snodgrass in this situation unless the big tube was actually pressed right up against that smaller vertical tube. So in this case, by breaking the lines, we're doing just the opposite. We're suggesting that there's some distance between the big tube and the little vertical tube. And one last thing I want to point out here is I'm going to zoom in down here in the bottom right. Those tiny little vessels, again, whether these are vessels on the surface of the intestine or the vasa vasorum on the surface of a larger artery, when I originally drew those, they looked like these structures that you see in the left, where the lines had very blunt ends that just squared off ends. So these were originally drawn as just a stroke, a black stroke. I did convert them to outlines, and you can see that when I select them, I think you can tell that they're actually outlined strokes. But they still have these very blunt ends. And I feel like that gives these lines a very stiff, mechanical kind of look that we want to try to avoid usually in medical illustration, because normally we're drawing body parts which have a more natural, organic look to them. So what I've done is I've tapered the ends to a sharp point. And we've actually talked about this in the past. You can take your white arrow and make a selection around the anchor points at the end. And then if you go to the object menu, path, average, or Command Option J on the Mac keyboard, you can then average those, select the option for both, and it puts those points together to create a sharp point. Same thing over here. I'll just use the keyboard command, Command Option J. Select both, and you see how you get a nice taper. Now you might also notice that there's some more snodgrasses here. Right there is a little triangular area where these two lines are meeting. And that also helps to make this branching point look a little bit more natural, a little bit more organic. You see that they're located up here as well. To create that, and I'll demonstrate this again in more detail shortly, but I'm going to take my pen tool. I've selected these lines, and I'm simply going to add a couple of anchor points right here in this little V-shaped area where the lines come together, and then delete the corner point, and that creates my snodgrass. So it's very easy to create. And you can see that I've done that with every single one of these tiny little vessels, tapered the endpoints and added little snodgrasses at their intersection. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of how to use variation in line weight to achieve a sense of depth, perspective, lighting, and overall to achieve a sense of three-dimensional form. Let me show you one more example just to drive the point home. Here's another one of my illustrations, and this, of course, is more of a real sort of finished illustration of an actual anatomic structure, and obviously this is the colon. And hopefully when you look at this, you have a sense that there's a little bit of depth and form to the colon. And I think one of the things that hopefully, if I did it right, one of the things that should jump out at you is that the transverse colon up here is coming towards you, coming towards the viewer. And that's achieved by making sure that the lines on both the bottom edge and the top edge of the transverse colon are a little bit thicker than the edges of the lines on the ascending colon and the descending colon over here. By making these lines a little bit heavier than the other lines of the other parts of the colon, it uses a sensor perspective to help bring that part of the transverse colon forwards. You can see that also down here a little bit with the sigmoid colon, because the sigmoid colon may also be coming out towards the viewer a little bit relative to both the ascending and descending parts of the colon. So we're trying to achieve a sense of depth and form here. The other thing is we're trying to achieve a sense of lighting. So again, if you look at the transverse colon up here, it should be pretty obvious that there's a heavier line on the bottom surface of the transverse colon, which would be in shadow, and a little bit thinner line on the top surface of the transverse colon, which would be the illuminated side. And it's a little bit more subtle in the other parts of the colon. I'm not sure that there's a real obvious difference here in the descending colon. I believe there is a more obvious difference here in part of the sigmoid colon leading down towards the rectum, where the upper left edge is a little bit thinner. The lower right edge down in here is a little bit thicker line. And then finally, there's a heavier outline that goes all the way around the colon. And then some of the internal details, in this case, the taenia coli, which are the little muscular bands that run the length of the colon, those are rendered with somewhat thinner lines, so they're not confused as being separate shapes. It's just texture on the colon itself. Actually, one last little thing I want to point out, or actually a couple little things, is notice where each of the haustra meets the edge of the colon, or where the little indentation here, the little groove here, meets the edge of the colon. There's a little bit of a snodgrass here where I've kind of filled in a little dark triangle. You can see them over here as well, those little filled in snodgrasses. But also right here, notice that there's a break in the line. And that's intentional to really help accentuate the idea that this transverse colon is coming out towards the viewer. It's not actually in direct contact with that part of the ascending colon. The transverse colon is actually out in front of that, so that little break also helps to imply a sense of depth. And you see that little break is here present in the taenia coli as well. So hopefully you can see how that helps make the transverse colon look like it's out in front of the ascending colon. And there's a little bit of that up here as well, up near the splenic flexure, where the transverse colon is out in front of a little bit of the descending colon.